Chair of Economics at Haverford College. She will be presenting on shock values, prices, and inflation in American democracy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Byron.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me. So this is actually, I guess, the first stop on my book tour. It's my first book talk for my book, which is coming out May 21st with the University of Chicago Press. And I fought long and hard to get this cover, not because of this cover in particular, but just because the first cover they gave me was neon pink and neon yellow, and was like horrible. And so I just fought to have anything other than. But I love, getting to share this book with you, and yeah, I think you'll be a great audience for my first book talk. So to get started, I started writing the book in 2021 when inflation was reaching levels that I hadn't seen in my lifetime, and that hadn't really been seen since the Great Inflation. Inflation passed 5%, which was something that just didn't seem like would happen anymore, but suddenly we had inflation surpassing 5%. So it was levels that the last time inflation had been to that level, all sorts of things were tried to bring it down. There was the Whip Inflation Now campaign, there was Nixon's price and wage controls, and nothing really worked until the Volcker disinflation, when we had a really major monetary policy tightening under Chairman Volcker. It, of course, came with a major recession, but it brought inflation down. And for many years after that, inflation was relatively low and stable, and there was central banks around the world started adopting inflation targeting regimes as it became a pretty wide consensus that price stability was something that could and should be managed by central banks. The US was a little late to the inflation targeting game, so we adopted inflation targeting explicitly in 2012. And both before and after that time, inflation was pretty low and near the target. But the recent rise in inflation really started to make people question that consensus and question this approach to price stability that for a few decades we had all been living with. So this, I think, is the article that got me writing the book, or that really made me think about writing this book. This was from the Washington Post, and they asked, what should the White House do to combat inflation? And they had different experts weigh in with ideas. One is just the way they questioned this. What should the White House do? I thought, the White House? Don't they mean the Fed? And indeed, nobody really mentioned the Fed, but the one that really caught my eye was this: consider using price controls. And this was a guy named Todd Tucker, and he said, the time is now to begin destigmatizing greater democratic control over price levels. And so he was saying somehow that price controls were the approach to price stability that was somehow democratic. And I was just like trying to think through this. Okay, what does it have to do with democracy, price controls, or any other kind of price stabilization? And Todd Tucker is from the Roosevelt Institute. And as I looked into this, I saw that Roosevelt himself had also used this kind of language in referring to price controls in World War II. He called the price controls and the rationing that has to go along with price controls the only democratic, equitable solution to the wartime economy. And this wasn't like a one-off. It wasn't just Todd Tucker calling for price controls. You started seeing more calls for them as inflation was high. People wanted something other than tighter monetary policy to address inflation. I think that the calls for price controls that we started seeing were really a symptom of discontent with our economic and political system and with the approach to price stabilization that we have been used to using. And I don't think that it was the high inflation in 2021 and 2022 itself that caused this discontent, but it sure made it more apparent when we started seeing these kinds of messages. So there were other kind of calls for forms of intervention in prices. So an overview of the book is is that my point in the book is that our approach to inflation and to price stabilization is really closely tied with our approach to democracy. And I want to try to provide an account of how price fluctuations and attempts to manage them, all sorts of attempts to manage them through price controls, monetary policy, tariff policy, and other means, have been part of America from the beginning and have really been so influential in shaping our government and people's beliefs about how the government works. So in the book, I try not to just provide like a monetary history, an economic history, but really a history of thought and about how people have thought about approaches to price stabilization. And so I draw on court cases, I draw on political science, what politicians have said, and what I've seen in the popular press. There's a few main themes, and I'll go through each of them, and then I'll kind of do the, in the relatively short amount of time I have, like the sweeping history through from the revolution to the present. So let me take the themes one by one. The first theme is about legitimacy and coercion. So Paul Tucker, a different Tucker, he was a central banker, he defines legitimacy as the public accepts the authority of institutions of the state and their right to deploy the state's powers. He says legitimacy grounds and comprises the capacity of an agency to pursue its mandate as part of the broader state apparatus without relying wholly on coercive power. So in thinking about the institutions like the Fed and institutions before the Fed, and even just thinking about our money, what is it that gives it legitimacy? And this idea of coercive powers is pretty important. So in a free market, the price mechanism coordinates economic exchange without any need for coercion because both sides of any exchange are agreeing to be part of that exchange. When you have interference in free markets, you're at least implicitly relying on the coercive power of the state. And the founders recognize this. They even recognize that making paper money legal tender could be a form of coercion, and that gave them some discomfort. So it was a process to get that accepted by the public as something that was legitimate. For example, John Witherspoon, who was at the Continental Congress, argued that price controls that were imposed during the Revolutionary War were illegitimate because they forced sellers to sell their wares at a price that they don't consent to. So this is how they thought, this is why they were uncomfortable with price controls. And this might not be the kind of argument we would hear against price controls now, which is more just they're not effective, but this is an argument based on price controls being coercive. You're forcing a seller to sell something at a price they don't consent to if you put a regulation on the price. So over the decades, there have been changing public priorities and also changing economic theories that have shifted what people view as legitimate ways for the government to try to stabilize prices. Okay, the second theme is about the disparate impacts of price fluctuations, that inflation and deflation impact different interest groups in different ways. Remember that the early United States was largely made up of farmers, and deflation tends to be hardest on farmers because they have a lot of nominal debts. Right? They'll buy seeds and land ahead of when their crops are produced. So they have nominal debt, which means that deflation is hard on them. Even by the time of the Constitutional Convention, the founders had seen that fluctuations in prices, especially in land prices or crop prices, could increase and then wipe out the prosperity of a large segment of the population, like the farmers. And so debates about the types of money and banking institutions that we would have reflected this concern that price fluctuations could really not only harm farmers, but could exacerbate tensions between the farmers and industrialists, and between different regions of the country that were affected by price fluctuations in different ways. And even as the farming share of the population declined, There's still been always this major challenge for politicians, which is to reconcile farmers' demands for higher prices with consumers' demands for lower food prices. So whenever we've had big episodes of inflation, which usually involve big episodes of food price inflation, politicians, they don't want to blame the farmers, but they also want to show consumers that they're willing to do something about it. So they tend to start blaming price gougers, profiteers, intermediaries, and monopolists. So looking for a way to blame a third party. Another theme is about contracting and due process, and this is related to the previous one. So because inflation and deflation have different effects on debtors and creditors, any change in prices affects debtors and creditors in different ways. So views about what is contract jurisprudence have also been really important to how the government has been able to intervene in prices. A lot of the court cases that I review in the book that have to do with monetary policy or price controls or tariffs have hinged on the interpretation of the contract clause and the due process clauses. The contract clause prohibits states from passing any law impairing the obligation of contracts. And then the Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's applied to the federal government. The 14th Amendment also applies that to the state governments. So now we don't think about because we have a dollar that's interfering with our contracts, but that was a worry in the Civil War when the government was printing greenbacks. The idea that, well, how can the government have a legal tender and say that you've made a loan in gold and now you're required to accept this paper money in exchange. So these are some of the important clauses that have to do with contracting that come up again and again. But the concern that price fluctuations themselves interfere with contracting has also been used as a motivation for a more active role of the state in price stabilization. Irving Fisher, who's one of the main characters in this book, who is a progressive economist and really active in politics, argued that with either inflation or deflation, you get incalculable injustice. One of the parties to every contract would be swindled for the benefit of the other, and the swindle would affect the fortunes for good or ill of almost every family in the land. So he used this idea of contracting as a way to say, well, what we actually need is what he thought a central bank that would perfectly stabilize the price level so that any party to a contract would be paid back or would pay the exact amount they had contracted for in nominal terms. Okay. Another kind of theme, it comes from a title of a book by Higgs in 1987, which was Crisis and Leviathan. And that's about the idea that wars and emergencies have this ratchet effect where they tend to legitimize a more active role of the state in the economic system, and it doesn't get totally reversed when the war or emergency ends. So each of the major wars, like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the World Wars, as well as other emergencies like the Great Depression and COVID-19, have really expanded what the executive and what the government in general does in terms of trying to intervene in the price system. And each time the expanded role has been partially pulled back, but not all of the way. So that's what I mean by a ratchet effect. And then finally on the themes is about the power of ideas and the long road to inflation targeting in the United States. Most histories of inflation targeting that you'll hear tend to start in 1989, and they say in 1989 the Reserve Bank of New Zealand adopted inflation targeting, And after that, a lot of other central banks followed suit, and the Fed eventually followed suit in 2012. But really, the idea of inflation targeting has its roots largely in the work of Irving Fisher, who spent decades pushing for the Fed to have a price stabilization mandate. And he had the ear of Congress, and he didn't live to see the Fed adopt inflation targeting, but he sort of paved the way for that adoption. Okay, so I'm going to start from the beginning and kind of go chronologically. I obviously don't have time to cover everything today, but the book is organized chronologically and just moves through the course of our history, how people have thought about price fluctuations and price stabilization. So in the colonial era, there was always this short supply of gold and silver, and this was because of the British mercantilism. The colonial governments tried issuing bills of credit to finance their military expenditure. Bills of credit are paper money, essentially. So these colonial governments had realized that they had this monetary power, and of course, the British Crown was not happy for them to have that power. And they passed these currency acts that prohibited the colonies from issuing paper money. And they cited the cost of inflation there. They said that these great quantities of paper bills of credit have been created, and they have greatly depreciated in their value. In other words, okay, the colonies are going to print a lot of money, they're going to create inflation, and then that's going to erode the values of debts. So it's this contracting idea. They issued these currency acts prohibiting the colonies from issuing bills of credit. But by the time of the Revolutionary War, of course, the United States, not yet the United States, but the Congress began issuing bills of credit called Continentals to finance the war. So it was Congress rather than the individual colonial governments. After a bunch of emissions of these Continentals, prices rose substantially. That's where we get the phrase, not worth a Continental. There was so much issuance that prices rose, the value of the Continentals fell. So what did Congress do? Well, they thought about trying to impose price controls. And they did impose some price controls, but there wasn't really the state capacity to impose them broadly. Because the Continental Congress wasn't able to enforce controls across the states. So they were only imposed locally and only on a few types of items. Members of Congress really were uncomfortable with price controls too. Most of them believed that price controls were illegitimate and that rising prices could only be remedied by reversing the monetary expansion that had caused them. So here's examples of two different views of price controls. Witherspoon said, "If you make a law that I shall be obliged to sell my grain, my cattle, or any commodity at a certain price, you not only do what is unjust and impolitic, but you speak nonsense, for I do not sell them at all, you take them from me." But then there was this other view by representatives at the New Haven Convention who said, "Must we be suffered to continue the exaction of such high prices to the destruction of the common cause, and of ourselves with it, merely because the reduction of the quantity of our currency may in time redress the evil, and because any other method may be complained of as an infringement of liberty?" So this is saying, right, reducing the quantity of currency could undo the evil of inflation, but it's going to take time. And they said, why should we complain about other methods that could work more quickly, like price controls? Okay, so price controls were not broadly imposed during the Revolutionary War. And what eventually ended the inflation after the war the Continentals stopped being issued, there was also deflation as lending from abroad contracted. So with the money supply shrinking and prices plummeting, land prices and farm prices especially were falling, and that really hurt the farmers because of their indebtedness. This was actually so painful for the farmers that there was an armed uprising called Shays' Rebellion. And it really demonstrated the political ramifications that could come from price fluctuations. So that would have been really kind of in the spotlight at the Constitutional Convention as the founders were thinking about what kinds of money and banking institutions they wanted. This idea that, like, if we do have these big price fluctuations, that could lead to rebellion, that could lead to just a lot of social unrest and political unrest. So yeah, they were thinking a lot about this issue of paper money because they saw that the paper money in the revolution had caused inflation, but also that it was something that it seemed necessary for their victory. So there were big debates about paper money and should the states be allowed to issue paper money? Should the federal government be allowed to issue paper money? And ultimately, right, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 says that states shall not coin money or emit bills of credit. That's paper money. But for the federal government, they left it more open. Article 1, Section 8 enumerates the powers of Congress, and it doesn't say that it doesn't say that they can emit bills of credit or declare a legal tender, but it also doesn't say that they can't. So that was kind of like a compromise position. They left it open. At the time, they adopted bimetallism and established the mint and the first Bank of the United States, which I'm not going to get into the history of the first bank right now, but it's in chapter 2 of the book. So after the first Bank of the United States was the second Bank of the United States. It had some of the functions of a modern central bank, but it wasn't exactly the same. But what's most known about it is that its major battle with Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson really didn't like the second Bank of the United States and the paper money. So his Jacksonians were known as the hard money men. He says that paper money, having no intrinsic value, is liable to great and sudden fluctuations, right? Inflation and deflation, rendering property insecure and wages unsteady and uncertain. These ebbs and flows in the currency and these indiscrete extensions of credit naturally engender a spirit of speculation injurious to the habits and character of the people. Okay, so he thought that that paper money really was actually bad for the American character, and saw it as the duty of the government to protect people from price fluctuations. So the kind of populist view at the time was quite different than the populist view now, and it was that we need to protect the people from price fluctuations by using specie, using gold or silver as money, gold especially. So President Jackson basically quashed the second Bank of the United States. He withdrew the government's deposits from the bank and vetoed its charter renewal. Kind of ironically, without the second bank there as a regulator, state banks were able to expand their note issuance and reduce their gold and silver reserves, resulting in even higher inflation. So there was high inflation and rising land and farm prices beginning in 1833 and culminating in the Panic of 1837. After this time, in what's called the free banking period, there were continuing price booms and busts. And one way that one kind of policy solution that was debated was tariffs. So remember, there's still no Federal Reserve, so they're not going to try to do monetary policy to stabilize prices. but there were pushes for tariffs as a way to affect prices, right? If you put, if you're a farmer and but your competitors abroad are selling the same thing at a lower price, you can then ask for a protective tariff, which is going to raise the price that farmer would get for the crop. But it wasn't always the case that farmers liked tariffs and other people disliked tariffs. It also depended on what you were selling and whether you thought that that others would impose retaliatory tariffs. So kind of in general, Southerners tended to dislike high tariffs that raised the prices they paid for manufactured goods, and they wanted to avoid retaliatory tariffs on the agricultural products they exported. But any kind of tariff policy as a solution to either rising or falling prices is going to lead to a lot of regional tension at a time in history when regional tension was already really high, so right before the Civil War. During the Civil War, the Legal Tender Act of 1862 permitted the Treasury to issue notes called greenbacks and make them legal tender, meaning you're required they're required. Sorry, it's been a long day. To make them legal tender, despite a lot of disputes over whether or not that was constitutional and over the economic consequences. So, for example, the Constitution grants Congress the power to raise and support armies and maintain a navy. So the argument was that the greenbacks were necessary and proper for this enumerated power. But that was a big debate about whether it was actually necessary to issue greenbacks in order to finance the war versus just raising taxes or borrowing. And there were a lot of debates about the inflationary consequences of the greenbacks. So they did end up issuing greenbacks. There was a lot of inflation as a result, but no price controls at the time. So there was still pretty strong laissez-faire ideology and then memory of ineffective price controls during the Revolutionary War. So that's why they didn't really try even to impose price controls during the Civil War. After the war was over, there were several Supreme Court cases revisiting that idea of whether the greenbacks were constitutional. So Hepburn versus Griswold said that the Legal Tender Act violated the Due Process Clause, saying an act making mere promises to pay dollars a legal tender in payment of debts previously contracted is not a means appropriate, really calculated to carry into effect any express power vested in Congress. It's inconsistent with the spirit of the Constitution and prohibited by the Constitution. But shortly after, Hepburn versus Griswold was overturned in several other cases. Just there was a change in the composition of the court itself. And this Juilliard versus Greenman case was even broader. It upheld the constitutionality of the Legal Tender Acts not only during a war, but even outside of wartime. So that made it possible to issue legal tender paper money anytime, not just in a wartime. Despite that, there was still this belief that we should get back to a species standard. We should get back to a gold standard and try to withdraw these greenbacks. But returning to a species standard after the war at pre-war parity would require deflation. It would require pulling all these greenbacks that have been issued out of circulation. And that's what the Contraction Act of 1866 began to do, to withdraw greenbacks from circulation, which causes deflation. Even more so after silver was demonetized in 1873. And you see, this was really unpopular. It became known as the crime of 1873 because of the deflation that followed. this is when the Granger movement started and really picked up steam. The Granger movement was like a fraternal society of farmers who pushed for policies that would help farmers, or that they thought would help farmers, including more expansionary monetary policy, like remonetizing silver, or reissuing greenbacks, but also including regulatory policy, forms of price controls. So they wanted, in particular, price regulations on the railroads because they relied on the railroads to get their ware to market. So a bunch of different states did pass these Granger laws that put price controls on the railroads. And the case Munn versus Illinois considered whether these types of controls on railroads or on private grain warehouses violated the due process clause. They said, the controlling fact is the power to regulate at all. If that exists, the right to establish the maximum of charge as one of the means of regulation is implied. We know that this is a power which may be abused, but that is no argument against its existence. So this case said that, yeah, imposing price controls isn't inherently a violation of the due process clause. But a case the next decade, Wabash versus Illinois, they said that the problem was if you had these price controls done by the states. An Illinois Granger law, it held was a burden on interstate commerce. So what that meant was that if Congress wanted price controls on railroads, it had to pass them at the federal level. They couldn't be passed by the states anymore. So after that, we get the Interstate Commerce Act, which required railroads to charge reasonable and just rates. And so this kind of idea of using regulatory policy to control kind of critical prices became part of what the federal government did and no longer part of what the state governments could do. Okay. So farmers also pushed for currency expansion as a policy that they thought would help them. At the time, it was the Republicans who favored the gold standard and higher tariffs. So you've probably seen this picture from a political cartoon. That's William Jennings Bryan. His Cross of Gold speech was really famous at the 1896 Democratic Convention, and in which he was calling for basically freeing the people from a cross of gold, saying we need currency expansion. We need either more greenbacks or silver to be remonetized to help the people, to help the farmers. And you know, he didn't quite win the general election. So it was a popular sentiment within his party. It got him the party nomination, but he didn't win the general election. That was William McKinley, who then passed the Gold Standard Act of 1900, which formalized the U.S. being on the gold standard. Shortly after that, there were new gold discoveries that actually produced deflation. So this whole issue of trying to stop deflation by leaving the gold standard kind of resolved itself as new gold discoveries did that. But as food prices began to rise, this is when editorial cartoons started blaming middlemen, trusts, and food speculators for price gouging. This inflation that started happening after 1900, it took a long time before anyone was like willing to admit any kind of monetary origins of that inflation. They thought it was due to like greed and price gouging. It wasn't until around 1910 that you can even see any U.S. Newspapers or attributing the inflation to monetary causes. You see more like the food monopoly versus the poor consumer. Okay. So this is Irving Fisher here on the left. who I mentioned already. But Irving Fisher published a really influential book called The Purchasing Power of Money in 1911. And that was at the time that plans were underway for the Federal Reserve System. So in his book, Fisher proposed what he called a compensated dollar plan. It was basically a plan for a central bank that would have price stability as its main objective and would change the weight of the dollar in terms of gold in order to keep prices stable. This was like really radical idea at the time because the gold standard was orthodoxy. But it actually almost made its way into the Federal Reserve Act. So Senator Robert Owen had been a delegate at that Crown of Thorns convention. He was familiar with Fisher's work, and he pushed for something like Fisher's idea, and that got into his bill. But when it was reconciled in Congress, they ultimately kept the U.S. on the gold standard. Shortly after the Fed was formed, World War I broke out, and so the Fed, during the war, just maintained low interest rates to support the Treasury. Keeping interest rates low during a time of a lot of wartime spending means you're going to have high inflation. Again, high food prices were being blamed on trusts and speculators. And eventually there was the decision to impose some price controls. The Lever Act of 1917 set price controls on wheat and prohibited excessive profits. Herbert Hoover, who later became president, was made the food administrator, so his nickname was the food czar. He really had broad powers to enforce any price controls that were imposed under the Lever Act. So he could seize firms' products, he could seize the whole firm, he could revoke a firm's license for alleged non-compliance, and the burden of proof was on the firm to prove that they hadn't done anything wrong, which is unusual. He later, Bernard Baruch, who later was the head of the War Industries Board, said, "We used a good many euphemisms for the sake of national morale, and this one of price fixing by agreement is one of them." So he said, we fixed prices with the aid of potential federal compulsion, and we could not have obtained unanimous compliance otherwise. So they tried to make it seem like the price controls were like voluntary, but behind that voluntary compliance was you know that your firm can just be seized if you don't comply. Hugh Rockoff is an economic historian who has written an entire book about these wartime price controls. And he has this, this is what he says about why price controls, even though they had their problems in World War I, they were more effective then than in other times. He says, the most important functions of the market are to reveal information about people's tastes and preferences. These are the kinds of questions that in peacetime, most people are willing to leave to the market because it responds to dollar votes. But in wartime, this information becomes superfluous. The needs of the military are relatively obvious and cannot be clarified by market activity. Thus, in wartime, the balance of virtues swings in favor of central planning, while in peacetime, because of the information it generates, the balance favors the market. And so he says in World War I, these worked relatively well in the sense that they were complied with, and they, like war mobilization was actually able to occur. As we'll see, the balance kind of changed during World War II as controls were broader and imposed for a longer period of time. Okay, but after World War I, everyone was expecting that prices were going to fall back to their pre-war levels, because that had always been the trend. You'd have a war, there'd be inflation during the war, then after the war, prices would fall back to the pre-war levels. But that didn't happen in World War I. The deflation failed to materialize because monetary expansion just continued. Even though the war was over, Wilson kind of said, look, we're still in something that's like a war. The prices that people are paying are too high. These high prices are created by vicious practices, which ought to immediately be checked by law. And so he was reluctant to remove all the price controls, and the Treasury was reluctant to let the Fed start using interest rates and using monetary policy as it would have before the war, right? They still kept interest rates, discount rates really low still to support the Treasury. Fed Governor Harding said that all legitimate steps were taken by the Federal Reserve Board to restrict inflation and speculation during 1919, except one, a sharp advance in the discount rates. That's the interest rates that they were using for monetary policy. The board felt that it was its duty to cooperate with the Treasury Authority. By the time they finally were able to increase discount rates in January 1920, according to Friedman and Schwartz, it was not only too late, but also probably too much. So they waited and waited to raise rates. They finally did, too late and too much, and we got this recession and deflation of 1920 and 21. So as in these earlier episodes, this deflation in 1920 and 21 hit farmers hard. Again, they pushed for basically three kind of categories of solutions to it: monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, regulations, and tariff policy. So Hoover, who had been the former price czar, said, I've done more price fixing than any other man who lives, and I would not propose price fixing in any form short of again re-entering the trenches in a world war. So he said, look, this was hard enough to do in a war. We shouldn't do it now. So it became really the Federal Reserve got into the spotlight. Like what can the Federal Reserve do to help the farmers? William Jennings Bryan was saying, the Fed, that should have been the farmer's greatest protection, has become his greatest foe. The deflation of the farmer was a crime deliberately committed out of indifference to him by the Fed. So we're getting, again, pressure on, the Fed should reverse this deflation and stabilize the price level. So throughout the 20s, a lot of proposals came to Congress, and they always had the backing of Irving Fisher to give the Fed a price stability mandate, to make to require all of the powers of the Federal Reserve System for promoting stability in the price level. Fisher made all of these arguments that this was the socially just thing to do, and then congressmen saying that this is the way that we can solve the farm problem. We need to get Congress to instruct the Fed to promote price stability. Governor Ben Strong of the Fed said he had doubts about the effects of this kind of a bill on the minds of the people who are not economists and who cannot really distinguish between individual prices and general prices. He said, is it possible that the farmers of the country will be advised that a mandate has been handed to the Fed to fix up this matter of farm prices? So this idea that I think there's still confusion about relative prices versus aggregate prices, like the price level. And Fisher was proposing that the Fed should stabilize aggregate prices, the price level. But the worry of Ben Strong was like, people don't understand what are aggregate prices. They'll think that the Fed is supposed to stabilize individual prices, or like that they need to stabilize the prices of different crops, which is price controls. And we still kind of hear this, like, I'm always asked by reporters about like, well, why isn't the Fed doing something about gas prices? Or why isn't the egg prices have really been rising? What's the Fed going to do about it? So it's that kind of fear. He expressed it a century ago, and it's still, I think, it was a really good insight. I probably need to speed along, but in the Great Recession, in some ways it mirrored but even more severe, the one in 1920 and 21. There's major deflation. Again, it was hardest on the farmers. Again, there's proposals for tariffs, for regulatory policies, and for price stabilization. It's called the Goldsboro Bill. And when Roosevelt was elected, he said, look, if we can't stop this fall in the prices of commodities, we may be forced to an inflation of our currency. I have not decided how this inflation can best and most safely be accomplished. What he eventually did to accomplish it was he devalued the dollar. It took the US off the gold standard, essentially. And Fisher thought, like, look, this shows that I was right all along. The fact that immediate reversal of deflation is easily achieved has just been demonstrated by Roosevelt. If inflation can so easily and quickly reverse the deadly downswing of deflation after 4 years, it would have been easier to have stopped it earlier. It would have been easier to prevent the Depression almost altogether. So he really took this as like vindication. So yeah, there were also price controls imposed during the recession by the National Recovery Administration. They negotiated price floors with different industries. And the Supreme Court upheld those at that point. Again, in World War II, this is when like the broadest price controls were imposed by the Office of Price Administration. They had this slogan, of the people, by the people, for the people, price control. So they really had, like, they called them little OPAs, like volunteers in every community. It was mostly housewives. They would go around and they would be like surveilling the store owners and making sure they were complying with price controls and not charging prices above the ceiling. But they were, made to think of this as like a patriotic duty. Meg Jacobs, who's written about this, says members of the OPA believed in a very invasive form of management democratized by mobilizing citizens and local communities to enforce rationing and controls. So they were able to, have that very invasive type of price controls in World War II and have the public be more or less behind it because basically people were kind of on board with the war, like they saw the necessity of it. That definitely wasn't the case in Korea. So there was less public support for the war, and there was also less tolerance for price controls. There was also this recognition that like all these different exceptions were being made as different industries would send lobbyists to Congress to get exceptions against having price controls on their products. And when people realized that, they really thought it was unfair, and they saw that meat prices were rising despite efforts to put controls on them, and it just undercut support for the controls program entirely. So we couldn't impose price controls. We couldn't cut government spending because it was a war. So it sort of left monetary policy as the only thing left for stabilizing prices. And that's when the Fed and the Treasury came to this accord that gave the Fed a lot more independence in setting interest rates. So they didn't have to continue that interest rate peg. During the 50s, right after the accord, there was pretty low and stable inflation. I'm going to just skip ahead since I'm running so low on time. Even Nixon, facing the great inflation, resisted initially the idea of imposing price controls because he had actually worked for the OPA at one point, and he thought of it as a scheme to socialize America. He said 50,000 OPA cops running around telling everybody, messing in your face and so forth. So he remembered like how invasive price controls had been under the Office of Price Administration. Didn't want to impose them again at first, but his Fed chair, Arthur Byrne, actually urged Nixon to adopt what was called incomes policy, which means wage and price controls. Because Burns thought, even though he was the Fed chair, he thought like monetary policy can't do anything about this inflation. it's not a monetary phenomenon. We need price and wage controls. And Nixon was convinced of that. He devalued the dollar and ended the Bretton Woods system, and at the time implemented price and wage controls. They came in a bunch of different phases that all had varying degrees of temporary success. But eventually, by the start of Gerald Ford's administration, using price controls to stabilize that inflation was just hopeless. Ford encouraged people to take voluntary actions to restrain inflation. He again didn't mention monetary policy. It wasn't until Volcker that the idea of using monetary policy, giving up the idea of trying to buy more employment with a little more inflation, like they finally gave up on that idea. Volcker finally kind of committed to getting prices under control, even at a harsh short-term cost. And he later gave a speech called The Triumph of Central Banking, when he said that at a certain point, public opinion will support strong policies to restore stability, even though they entail a harsh short-term cost. Okay, so I'm going to skip some more. Okay, the Fed eventually by 2012, after many years of debate about it, announced an explicit 2% inflation target. This was during the slow recovery from the Great Recession. The recession was over, but unemployment was still very high. In 2015, inflation was below target. Unemployment was gradually falling, and the Fed decided to raise interest rates because they anticipated that inflation was going to pick up as the labor market recovered. They got a ton of criticism for that, including by this group called the Fed Up Coalition. They really criticized the Fed for focusing too much on price stability and too little on employment, even when inflation was low. And this kind of sentiment, it was really influential. It made its way into the Fed's framework review in 2019-2020. They went around the country listening to basically people from community groups, labor groups, leaders of all sorts of think tanks and unions, and hearing that people said, yeah, we think you're focusing too much on price stability. We don't actually mind a little bit of inflation. We really care about low unemployment. So the Fed, after that framework review, adopted average inflation targeting. They modified their framework to say, we're going to try to get inflation that averages 2% over time, but we're going to be asymmetric about it. So if we undershoot our inflation target, we'll make up for it with some period of above 2% inflation. But if we overshoot it, we're going to just let bygones be bygones. So it's asymmetric, and which really means that they're going to average inflation above 2%. Yeah, and I think that was a reason why, even in 2021, when inflation surpassed the Fed's target, they were kind of slow to respond because they said, well, it's actually good if we let inflation be above target for a while because it was below target for a long time. So this asymmetry in their new framework was played a role in the slow response to recent inflation. There was this whole debate you probably heard called team transitory, right? People debating whether the inflation in 2021 and 2022 was transitory or not, without a clear sense of what does transitory actually mean. Even as the Fed, though, admitted that, okay, inflation's not transitory, we've got to do something about it, there was still just a lot of disagreement about the causes of inflation and the best solutions, and a lot of reluctance to using monetary policy to bring inflation down. I think because of the fear that would cause unemployment. So you saw Elizabeth Warren gave a lot of speeches along these lines, today's price increases have many causes, but the Fed should tread carefully. They should leave it to the FTC, the Department of Justice, dealing with crooked price fixers, and so on. And then you also see a lot of blaming the inflation on Vladimir Putin and rising oil prices. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act, for example, that's not anything to do with monetary policy. It's a grab bag of different policies that a small majority of Americans were in favor of it, but only 12% thought it would actually reduce inflation. Okay. So by August 2022, Chairman Powell was starting to sound a lot more like Paul Volcker. He was taking those lessons more seriously. He said central banks can and should take responsibility for delivering low and stable inflation. We must keep at it until the job is done. And since I've written the book, I'm waiting for it to go through the publication process. Inflation has declined without the recession that many people feared would come. It's still high. The CPI report came out yesterday. It was a little higher than expected. It's still, it's taking a long time for inflation to come back down to target. And there's a lot of discussion about what should be done? Should we raise the inflation target? Do we need a different kind of monetary policy framework? And the Fed has another framework review coming up in 2024 and 2025 that's going to broach a lot of these issues. Personally, I think that removing the asymmetry of the average inflation target, or considering something like in GDP targeting, would be helpful, especially if the Fed commits to it in a more transparent way, where it's more rules-based and less discretion, for the purposes of allowing the public to know what they're doing and to predict what is coming. I think raising the inflation target would be a bad idea. I don't think it would be consistent with the price stability mandate anymore if we had a target higher than 2%. The other thing I kind of warn against the book is living in a perpetual emergency economy, right? There's the world wars where true emergencies where price controls maybe had their place, but I think there's a greater tendency now to call a lot of things emergencies, and then just the frequency with which the president uses emergency powers has really increased. So I kind of caution against that in the book. But this was my last slide, so if we do have time, I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Probably about 5 minutes for questions. Anyone have one that they're bugging off their chest right away?
Do you see going back to talking about M2 as a cause of inflation rather than, the Fed right now seems to be saying we've got aggregate demand bigger than aggregate supply, so we're raising interest rates whereas M2 grew by 40% between February of 20 and February of 22, and then we get the inflation. So do you think that the Fed will eventually start talking about the change in the money supply is affecting?
I've heard people talk about that, not people that are within the Fed, though. I think during the Great Recession, with the QE programs, people were saying the money supply and the size of the Fed's balance sheet doesn't really matter for inflation, so they sort of neglect looking at monetary aggregates. I think using the Fed funds rate as the stance of monetary policy is pretty ingrained at the Fed at this point. I don't see that going away anytime soon. There's a few people, Peter Ireland has done a lot of work, good papers lately about like he's pushing for the Fed should pay attention to the money supply, and he's on the shadow open market committee, which is like a group of people that sort of pretends to be the Fed and holds conferences and said, like, if we were the Fed, this is what we would be thinking about. So, but that's considered definitely an outsider view. Yes.
So, I'm actually thinking of several questions, but I'll ask the first one. You've got quite a lot of history you've looked at a lot of history of this. Do you see anything that looks like a political business cycle where it's manipulated at all in this?
Yeah, I mean, there's different times presidents like pressure the Fed to have looser monetary before an election. So the probably most famous is Nixon Burns. And there's a paper where the author has gone through like these audio. He actually like listened to all these tapes that had recordings of discussions they'd had where Nixon would tell Burns, like, he was even thinking about with what lag does monetary policy work, and say, I don't care what you do after like April, but before then you need to do this, or saying, well, April's too close to the election, so anything you do after that won't matter. I mean, there are a lot of empirical papers trying to like test whether monetary policy is systematically looser before elections, and does it matter if the Fed chair and the president are of the same party or not. I think there's kind of very weak evidence that like it systematically makes an impact, but you can see like right now the Fed is just trying to be super careful because they don't want to look like they're being like swayed either way with the election coming up, right? Whatever the Fed does this year, somebody's going to say, oh, you're trying to help Biden, or oh, you're trying to help Trump, and it's almost like they can't win no matter what they do. But
Is there any reason to think that, well, like which way the pressure goes, either from the White House on the Fed, or from the Fed thinking, oh, we want to dump this president or something?
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot from the White House on the Fed. It then like eventually became a norm that the president shouldn't have these kinds of meetings with the Fed chair where he goes and walks around in the garden with him and tells him what he needs to do. But then that norm sort of reversed. Like there was on the slides, there's one of them like President Trump would tweet a lot about like criticisms of the Fed, which well, I don't know how many presidents had Twitter, but that was like, I think that wouldn't have been considered the norm. Like if Bush or Obama had Twitter, they wouldn't have done that because it was seen like central bank independence was pretty like exalted. I don't know of any evidence that the Fed has tried to like cause a recession to get the president out. I think that's pretty unlikely in the U.S. I can imagine others in other countries that happening. Yes.
Based off of your research, which has had more harmful effects on the American population, inflationary times or deflationary times?
Oh, that's a really good question. But I would say, I mean, because of the Great Depression, I'd say it almost has to be deflation. Like that was just the worst macroeconomic years that we've faced, and those were deflationary. It's not that deflation is always good or always bad, just like it's not that inflation is always good or always bad, but that was like a particular case of really bad deflation because it wasn't coming from, you could have deflation coming from, productivity is just growing really fast, so companies can reduce their prices even though output is increasing. That's not what was happening in the Great Depression. We had deflation and high unemployment and low output led to all these like bank failures and So I think deflation on net has probably been worse just because of the Great Depression. Some of those earlier panics in like the 1800s were pretty bad too, and they mostly involved deflation. I heard my baby crying a lot during the talk, so I should probably attempt to find her and save the babysitter.
She might have a question.
Okay,
Thank you again.
thank you.